Evidence of evolution. This video will discuss the sources of evidence that support the theory of evolution, and this is important so we don't end up like a friend over here, the dodo bird. So where does the actual support come from? We'll go through each one of these separately in a second. So the fossil record supports evolution through this idea of transition species or transition fossils. The anatomical record supports evolution through homologous and vestigial structures. The molecular record, DNA sequences and protein sequences, support evolution, and also comparative embryology, looking at the embryos or the development structures of organisms show evolution. So as I said, we'll go through each one of these separately. And there's a lot of vocab in this chapter that you need to understand and be able to recognize on the test and be able to apply. How does the fossil record support evolution? There's layers of sedimentary rock that contains fossils. So we know that new layers cover old layers, creating a record over time. So you can see in the Grand Canyon all the different layers. Each one of them is a different point in history. So what we can look at is we can look at the fossils in each layer and actually chart how they've changed over time. Those are known as transition fossils. So we can actually take the fossils at the different time levels, geological time levels, and we actually can show how a species changed over time. This is especially true in horses. We have all these horse fossils, and we could map out how they actually changed over time to the modern day horse. So those are transition fossils that show the transition from ancestor species until current day species. Another example of this is the evolution of birds. If you've ever watched Jurassic Park, you should know that birds are modern day dinosaurs. Or I should say that birds came from dinosaurs that evolved. So how do we actually know this is true? Well, we found a transition fossil. We found Archaeopteryx. They lived about 150 million years ago, and it actually links reptiles and birds together. You can see that it actually kind of looks like a half bird, half reptile looking thing. And in Jurassic Park they mentioned how the raptor is very similar to today's birds. So you can see it was a flying dinosaur basically that eventually became the modern day bird. So this is an example of a transition fossil showing how today's organisms descended from ancestral species. Let's give an example of a mammal using this. As you hopefully know, whales are mammals. They are air-breathing, oxygen-breathing, and are not actually fish, but they live in the ocean with fish. So in Origins of Life, we talked about how most life came from the sea. Well, for some reason, whales went from the land as a mammal back into the ocean. So the question is, where are these transition fossils? Where are these fossils that actually show the evolution from a land mammal back into an ocean mammal in the modern day whale? So someone's idea of a joke, they created this cartoon which was around for about 15 years of this thing, whatever this is, as being the intermediate between the land mammal and the modern day whale. Well, the joke's actually on them, because we found a fossil that you notice looks very, very similar to their cartoon drawing. Once this fossil discovery was made in the 1990s, this cartoon disappeared and was never seen again, because we actually did find the fossil showing the evolution from a land mammal back to an ocean mammal, the modern day whale. And you see there's all the different ones. And you can see there's the complete series of transition fossils. You can see every step how there's a slight little difference that adds up over time to create the modern day whale. So evolution from sea to land. So this is the opposite way. This was how the first land organisms were developed. So in 2006 we actually found a discovery of the first early tetrapod. So you can see that on the right hand side of the first mammal that really, or not mammal, the first animal that just went from the ocean to the land and actually survived on the land. So it is that missing link from the sea to the land animals. The second source of evidence for evolution, comes from the anatomical record, or the structures of an organism. So you can see that in each of these pictures, we have a different structure on the surface. So you have the human hand, the cat foot, the bat wing, the whale flipper. However, when you look under the skin of them, it tells us that we actually came from a common ancestor. Even though the outward appearance of all of our appendages look different, the human hand, the cat foot, the whale flipper, and the bat wing, underneath the skin, they have practically the same bones. So you can see that the limbs perform different functions, but are built from the same bones. They all have this same wrist-like structure in them at some place. So the question is, how could these very different animals actually have the same bones? Why would a human hand have the same bone structure as a bat's wing and a whale's flipper when they are used for very different functions? These structures that have the same structure, same bone structure, but a different function, are known as homologous structures. So there's that word homologous again. So they are structures that come from the same origin. So remember, homo means same, and logos means structure or information. So the four limbs of humans, cats, whales, and bats all have the same structure on the inside, which means that they're the same development in the embryo, but have very different functions on the outside. So homologous structures show common ancestry. Why the heck would your hand be just like a bat's wing and a whale's flipper when they do completely different things, unless there's some common ancestor that all three of these species came from that had that original bone structure? So homologous structures is a word you need to know, and it is the same structure, different function, and it shows common ancestry. Don't be fooled by these, though. So in this case, you're looking at the bird's wing and the dragonfly's wing. So how is a bird like a bug? Not that much, except for the flying part of it. These are known as analogous structures. So analogous structures look similar on the outside. A bird's wing and a dragonfly's wing, pretty similar structure on the outside. They both used for flying. So they have the same function, but they have a completely different structure and development on the inside. So therefore they came from a different origin. So analogous structures show no evolutionary relationship. It is just solving a similar problem with a similar solution. Birds needed to fly, insects needed to fly. They both came up with a different way to build a wing. So analogous structures are the same function, but a different internal structure. And they do not show common ancestry. They have no relationship amongst each other. More examples of analogous structures: dolphins and fish. Dolphins, as you also should know, are aquatic mammals, breathe air. Fish are aquatic vertebrates, so they breathe in water. Both adapted to life in the sea. However, they are not closely related, because one's an air breather and one's a water breather. But they both have similar structures. They both have fins, so therefore the fins of a dolphin and a fish are analogous. They are not closely related, but they came up with the same solution to a similar problem. They needed to swim. Analogous structures bring up the concept of convergent evolution. There's the bat, the bird, and the insect. All three of them have the ability to fly and have wings. So the question is, does that mean they actually share a recent common ancestor? And the answer is no. They just came up with the same answer. So flight actually evolved 3 separate times. The insects developed it first, the birds second, and then the mammals last. So convergent evolution is the idea that different species converge or develop similar characteristics due to a common environment. All three of these organisms needed to be able to fly to survive in their environment, so they each came up with a way to be able to fly that fits them. So convergent evolution is unrelated species coming together or converging to common structures to solve the same environmental problem. The last type of structure you need to know is known as vestigial structures. So they are structures on animals that have absolutely no function, so they're leftovers. So they're remains of structures that probably were functional in ancestors. There's a lot of examples of them. So you have some snakes and whales actually have pelvic bones, hip bones in them from when they used to have legs. Yes, a snake used to walk just like a whale. Eyes on blind cavefish. Why would you have eyes if you're blind? And also our human tailbone. Why do we have a tailbone when we don't have a tail? Same thing with another part of your body you've heard of, the appendix. Currently, we don't think the appendix has a function, so it's vestigial. Maybe it did in the past. Maybe when we had a more rough diet, we had to eat more grasses and whatnot, we needed it. But over time, it's become useless. Now, they're still there because they're not hurting us. If something doesn't hurt us, it's not going to disappear over time. So they're just leftovers until probably till the end of time. The last two sources of evidence for evolution are much shorter than the previous two. So you have the molecular record, which is comparing DNA and protein structure. This is how we actually do it the most now, and this is how we really show evolutionary relationships, looking at your individual genes. And remember, this works because we all have the same universal genetic code. We all have DNA and RNA, and we are all very similar in what we need to get done in our cells. Usually you compare common genes, such as cytochrome C. You will not need to know cytochrome C or hemoglobin, just examples of common genes that all organisms on this planet need some version of. Cytochrome C is used in cellular respiration. We all need to create ATP, so there's some version of that in all living organisms. Same thing with hemoglobin and gas exchange. That carries the oxygen in our blood, so that's kind of important for most animals on this planet to have some kind of molecule that carries oxygen around their body. So we compare the genes. The ones that are most closely related have the more similar sequences than those that are distantly related. I may mention in class at some point that you and a banana have 70% the same DNA. So the more DNA sequence you have in relationship to another organism, the closer you are actually related to that organism. In the graph, we can see the differences between our hemoglobin structure and the different organisms in this cladogram. So you can see there's 8 differences between us and the monkey. There is 32 between us and a dog, 45 between us and a bird, 67 between us and a frog, and 125 between us and the lamprey. So this graph shows that the more differences you have in this one gene, the farther away you are related to each other. So the closer you are, the more related you are, the closer your genes actually are together. Finally, we have the last evidence for evolution, which is comparative embryology, which says that if you have a similar embryological development, you're probably closely related. The example of this is vertebrate embryos. All of the vertebrates have a gill pouch, which, if you're a fish, becomes the gills. You can see that the fish, the reptile, the bird, and the human all have that blue gill pouch, which means why would birds, humans, and reptiles have a gill pouch when we don't have gills, unless we came from a common ancestor? And you can see, looking at the actual picture, the reptile, the bird, the human, even the tortoise and the chick, all of them look very similar to each other. So comparative embryology just says that if you look very similar as an embryo, as you're developing in the uterus, then you probably shared a common ancestor, because the grown-up version of a bird and you are very different, but the actual embryo version is very similar. So this is the last slide. That you need to understand the fossil record, how it supports evolution, the anatomical record, how it supports evolution, the molecular record, how it supports evolution, and finally comparative embryology, which is probably the easiest in how it supports evolution.